Hello and welcome to another episode of New Narratives Political Agenda, hosted by me, PJ Thum. I am wearing a red and black batik shirt and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. This podcast is brought to you by New Narrative, a movement for democracy in Southeast Asia. And if you like this podcast, please do join us as a member at newnarrative.com/join or donate at newnarrative.com/donate. We are entirely supported by membership revenue, so we really do need your help and support to keep alive. My pronouns are he, him, and today we've got with us Mysara Aljaru, who is a writer, researcher, and most recently was seen as part of the play Brown is Haram. Hello, Mysara.
Hi, PJ. Hi, everyone. I'm Mysara. I'm wearing a pink and gray dress, and I'm sitting behind a tiled background. And my pronouns are she and her. Thank you
I have
for
to say that tiled background is really beautiful.
Thank you. Yes, this is wallpaper.
Okay. I thought it was tiles, but those are traditional tiles found in homes in Singapore, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, when I decided I wanted to revamp my room in my family house, like me and my mom were like, okay, this is really cool. Definitely had to get it.
Yeah, it really looks nice. Okay, so Mysara, tell us about yourself, what you do and how you got into it and so on.
Right. So my day job currently is a strategist at a tech company. So previously I was a journalist and producer with mainstream media in Singapore. Well, we don't have to say which one, you can just either, So I was working there for a couple of years, started off as an intern. And then I left in 2018 to do my master's, where currently I'm researching on mainstream media narratives on the Malay development. So I'm finishing my thesis now. And I think by chance, when I was looking at mainstream media and understanding how it works and how close, the state or very much, the state is involved in it, I grew fascinated in unpacking narratives about my community and myself. So I started out writing. I've written and published in a few publications, including Budi Kritik and Growing Up Perempuan. And then by chance, Objectives, which is a gallery that focuses on Southeast Asian photographers and filmmakers, offered me to do an exhibition for their Women in Film and Photography program they have every year. So this was in 2019. And that was when I realized that two of my interests, which is academia and art, could be placed together, right? I realized that art and academia are both in some sense insular in their own way. And I was very fascinated in how I can bring these two together. So along the way, I guess I decided to look into narratives and structures and papers that like academics and professors have written about race, and use art as a platform to make it easier for like your everyday person to understand. So my motto has always been, if my mom doesn't understand, then I have failed. Or if the makcik, at the nasi padang stall doesn't understand, then I have failed.
Right.
Yeah, so that has always been, I think, my motive. Also because, I have like family and friends of all different backgrounds, and I've come to realize we all share similar experiences. It's just that how we are like talking about it or how we deliver about it is different. And of course, I think as one of the so-called educated Malays, I am seen quite differently. People do listen to me. And I think that is something that I hope to break in the future, where you don't have to have a degree or master's degree or PhD for people to understand what you're trying to say. Yeah.
Okay, gosh, lots to unpack there. But let's start with why decide to go into this career from one in the mainstream media, right? What makes a person in Singapore, especially, you're a double minority being a woman and Malay, give up something that seems very comfortable and safe, where you could actually, from that position, you would have the security to take some risks to actually strike out on your own, do this master's, do this writing, and take all those risks and in an effort to, understand your community and create change?
I think it came from realizing that no matter how educated I can be, even if they listen to me more, I know that I'm never going to be seen as like an equal. So then that question for me would be, do I want to stay in an environment where I have to like shout in a sense to be heard, or like, only be I always have to be in a constant state of, am I doing enough? And live in this like constant anxiety that, any mistake that you made is going to be attributed to your race. So I decided it wasn't actually like the best is like environment because it wasn't helping me in terms of my mental health. And this whole like, the very backhanded compliments that I would get outside would be like, oh wow, you're educated, oh wow, you're working in the mainstream media. I don't see a lot of Malays working in English, networks, because people immediately assume that you're like a reporter for like Berita Harian or Surya, because like there's nothing wrong, of course. It's just that this assumption that you cannot produce content for the wider society. It is a backhanded compliment. So I decided, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. And I needed to be in an environment where I feel like I can really achieve what I want to, without that constant anxiety, without feeling like, I'm going to bring my whole community down. It sounds very loaded, but I think at that point it was something that I felt constantly, and I needed to like get myself out of it, where I am not constantly in an environment where I feel that they are also reproducing, I guess, sentiments about my community that is, I would say it's not true, right? And also, lacks a lot of research and understanding. So I realized that being as you mentioned, a double minority, I needed change. And I guess I had that privilege of living to find my own space.
Right. And so why do the masters and work on these narratives? Was there something that in particular, triggered that interest as opposed to doing something else?
Yeah. So I think when I was in the process of deciding about whether I wanted to leave my job, I have friends who were completing their masters, who just completed the masters. So like for those who are not like familiar with me, I'm doing my masters in the Malay Studies faculty in NUS. So I had friends there and we're talking about it. And I realized that I feel like there needs to be more research on mainstream media narratives on the Malay community. So I read one of the professor's paper, Dr. Suriani, where she looks at this term of problematic Malays and how it has developed in the mainstream media. Especially like nowadays, where suddenly everyone wants to talk about race, even the mainstream media is starting to make documentaries and content about race. It still lacks a lot of nuances, I feel, and understanding of how such narratives are formed, and how the state is also very much responsible for such of these narratives that we know of as of today. Yeah, so I decided that, what, this an area of my interest. Media has always been something like that is of my interest, but I wanted to go further than what I was doing. So I decided, what, why not like look at this for my master's thesis.
Oh, great. Okay. So what are these narratives? What is your research telling you?
So for me, because there's a lot, obviously a lot of things like going on, what I've always been fascinated and like looked into is understanding this idea of progress, right? And year after year in National Day, like rarely you hear the Prime Minister say, like having a special like speech in Malay, thanking all the Malay communities like for progressing, like you guys did a good job. And of course, when you grow up, you're like, oh, okay, great, like my community is doing great. But when you grow older, you realize it's actually a very condescending way of addressing the issues that the community is facing. And it has always been framed as it's a you problem. Your community is not doing well. You guys need to catch up. But there's never an understanding of why. Why did that happen? When did that start? Why are we still not like catching up to the other communities? Right? So you can go on TV and live TV and tell all of us we're doing well, but it still does not address the underlying issues that we are still facing currently. So what I've seen so far, I think in my research is that you see that, I guess, I think because people are a bit more outspoken about race now, you see that the headlines change a little bit. But when you read further, you realize like, hey, like not much has changed. It's still very condescending. And more interestingly, you see more and more narratives coming from the Malay elites, even like, even more, talking about how we need to progress. In some sense, we are doing better than like even Malays in Malaysia. We are better Muslims. We have to be better Muslims than like Muslims in Malaysia, which I honestly don't understand why there's even a need to like compare. But yeah, it's just a very condescending tone that has been going on since forever, and I'm very fascinated, I think, hopefully along the way, beyond like narratives, to see how that affects the community and how we see ourselves.
Okay, before we start unpacking each one, what other narratives do you see? I mean, if I can volunteer very carefully, the crude stereotypes that we usually see, right? The first is the Malay community, related to what you're saying, is not as interested in progress. Usually, under the euphemism, Malays are more family oriented. That Malays aren't interested in modern capitalism. Very problematic. Perhaps another one is that Malays are, and I think there's a correlation to crime, right? Higher numbers in convicted of crime in prison. There's another narrative about diet, that Malays are less healthy because of the food you eat. Are these stereotypes? Are these also part of the mainstream media narratives? Have you looked at them?
Yes, definitely. Like these frequent narratives that we hear over and over again. Food would be a very interesting one. I think if I'm not wrong, in 2012, there was an article today where they had a picture of nasi lemak and roti prata, and the headline was, Malays and Indians are more prone to diabetes. And that made me laugh because there's this assumption that like, oh, that's all we eat every day, nasi lemak and like prata. So number one, there's a lack of understanding of what Malay cuisine is. I found it very interesting because they got a quote from a Malay man, a Malay uncle, because I think he was in like the article was in his 50s, and he said, yes, the problem with Malays is that we like, the Chinese are more active. He said that in the article, and then he proceeded to say that the Malays, all we do is we go to the beach, have a picnic, and swim. And I was thinking to myself, isn't swimming a physical activity? you know? And when you go to the beach and you see like Malay families, the kids are running around, they are playing, So everyone does that. It's not a race issue, right? When you go to the beach to have picnic. But I found it fascinating that, this internalized like narrative, like, yes, my community is lazy, we don't exercise, even when we swim, it's still not considered like a physical activity. And then I remember the article, it also states that we have like late night suppers and things like that, but I'm like, I think that's exclusive to every community. It depends on which area you live. If you go to like Geylang, you have a lot of Chinese like food shops open like till late at night, so that part is missing. But of course, this whole idea when it comes to food and health, about how that links to the socioeconomic classes of minorities, right? And whether the minorities have access to proper healthcare, to fresh food. And I remember there's this Malay lady, she does this I guess it's like a weekly activity where she gets fresh produce from the market, where it's produced like vegetables where people don't want to buy because it doesn't look as green, the leaves doesn't look as green. She takes them and she gives it to people living in low income housing. And one of the things she told me is that, because people would be like, when you see all these like I guess state-run like organizations giving out, we are here, let's give out like free food to the needy. It's always unhealthy canned food, right? You don't think about, okay, we need to give them fresh produce so that they can have like a balanced diet. So it does correlate. Health does obviously correlate, as a lot of like research people have shown, to how it relates to socioeconomic class. Right. I think that's like the most important thing that we don't hear about.
Right.
We see like a high numbers of like percentages of Malays living in rental flats, and how that links to why we see like, so there are so many Malays with health problems, and it's so funny also, when you do your research on the ground, you talk to the community, one of the things they will always say, all this like young Malay men, or like abang-abangs, I like to call them, they'd be like, they call us lazy, but we work 2 jobs, we have like to make sure that our family lives, comfortably. So are we going to say that they are lazy and that they're unhealthy, they're just sitting in homes and things like that? And I think, with everything you say, and I think the umbrella stereotype of Malays being lazy, and that we don't desire that the idea of success, is it is assumption that we don't desire the Chinese majority's idea of like capitalist success, right? Because even though I guess like right now I do have like a corporate job, that's not my idea of like success, right? You need to get a job to pay your school fees, to pay the bills, to have your family. But just because someone doesn't have like I want to work in a bank, in a CBD, and then like go for a staycation at the end of the month, which is why I think the very consumerist idea of what success is doesn't mean someone is not successful. And I think over time, even like younger Malays who, of course, you see more educated Malays having better paying jobs as compared to like their parents' era. They may not necessarily like subscribe to this very Chinese-centric idea of what success is, because also we realize that idea, that circle of successful Chinese majority will never include us. And I guess, when they say that Malays don't aspire to that, is really, I guess, sometimes it feels like, I won't say sometimes it really does come from the majority's biased idea of a minority. And this expectation of us to break or to form our identity into what the majority wants. So I always say, right, to be Singaporean is to be Chinese, because, the Chinese ideal of what success is and what being a Singaporean is what forms Singapore today, right? And the moment you don't fall into it, you don't conform yourself into it, you're not seen as successful, you're seen as lazy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, again, well, so much to unpack.
Yeah.
So first of all, your picnic anecdote actually reminds me of how the government and elites talked about communism in the 50s, right? Because what you saw is a lot of Chinese trade unions, which and student groups, right, who were the main sources of resistance to colonial rule. They would go off and have picnics, and they would talk to each other about politics. Because of course, you're decolonizing. Politics is important. So in the official documents, what you see is, oh, this is a classic communist technique of self-study, and therefore these people must all be communists and probably linked to communist China. But the fact was, right, everyone was doing picnics. You see Malay organizations, Indian trade unions, right? Anyone who was working class or poor, both, anyone not part of the elite, which was 95% of Singapore back then. Because think about Singapore in the 50s. What are you going to do if you want to hang out with your friends? Where are you going to go? It's not like there were so many free places or cheap places, and we were very poor back then, right? So the easiest way to socialize and have a good time is to go and have a picnic in a park or on the beach. That's why everyone was doing it. But somehow, for groups that the government assume were communist, this was classic form of Chinese indoctrination and self-study. But for Malays doing it, oh, look, it's the Malays, they're having fun, It's so the activity itself was more of how you looked at the activity. It said more about the people looking at you than about who you were. And so that reminds me, very much of that. And your anecdote reminds me of that. And again, it's the same thing, that how we interpret things actually depends very much on our already internalized values. And it sounds like what you're describing is that your community itself, because of the dominance of these narratives, has also internalized many of these values. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, definitely. And it's so funny, right? Like even an activity like going on a picnic is racialized.
Yeah.
And then right.
Yes.
But it's just an activity of people like relaxing after a long day of work or just wanting to spend time with each other. But of course, that falls into this whole idea of like how everything is racialized in Singapore, right? I mean, with the wonderful CMIO that everyone knows about, where if you do something that's not stereotyped in your community, then there's something wrong with you. I have a friend who's Chinese, and she was telling me, yeah, like she'll hear narrative like, oh, don't be lazy like the Malays, right? Or like the moment she takes a break, oh, why are you so lazy? You want to don't be like a Malay. I felt bad for her in that sense, where this idea to be like a Chinese also to be like working 24/7.
Yeah. It's exhausting. It's
Yeah.
really exhausting.
Yeah. So you see two extreme ends where the Chinese are always working and the Malays are just like not doing anything. And anything that falls in between or has a balance doesn't exist. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I just wanted to like bring that up where I think no one is allowed to have a balance, and that's where all these stereotypes like comes about.
Okay, so if I can challenge you a bit, Mysara, though, it sounds like you're also racializing things a bit yourself, because you talk about the Chinese majority, and to be in Singapore is to be Chinese. And of course, there's a lot there that is true. But it sounds like you're describing is capitalism and neoliberal capitalism and the forces of it acting upon all of us, where for your community, the problem is essentially poverty. where studies have shown it's very, very hard to get out of poverty, no matter where you are in the world, because there are a lot of self-perpetuating characteristics within capitalism that benefit the elites, those who have capital. You know, Piketty has described how capital grows at a faster rate than income, wage income. And then also we have mechanisms of meritocracy. For example, meritocracy has been shown, right, to not be actually meritocratic, but a system through which the elite justify benefiting themselves and reproducing themselves, right? That's why we have a scholarship system. And then people who get the scholarship, 99% look exactly like the elite. And then there's the 1% token, who don't look like the elite. And then that's evidence that it succeeds. And then, of course, like there are plenty of Chinese who don't subscribe to that view of success, right? I mean, if I can offer myself, I've never sought a corporate job or a high-paying one, and I'm quite content to not earn much, but I do something that's really fulfilling and important, And indeed, conventionally in Singapore, what I've done is suicide, right? Because I've made an enemy of the entire establishment, the system. So if I can suggest, what it sounds like is we're talking about structures of neoliberal capitalism. And it's just because Singapore's majority are Chinese, they have taken on those as the boundaries, as the gates that must be kept, right? Whereas if you look at the elite in Malaysia, right, it's the Malays who, the conservative Malay leadership who have created the boundaries, and the Chinese who are adapting to that by behaving more Malay, becoming Muslim, and so on and so forth. So in every country, what we see is really that the forces of capitalism and nationalism, right? That's another thing, that you're talking about things on a very nationalist, in terms of nations, not in terms of states. The Chinese race, aka nation, the Malay race, aka nation, you've constructed these boundaries and borders. So it sounds like we've also kind of internalized some of these boundaries in terms of nations, when really what we should be thinking about structurally is that it's neoliberal capitalism, it's nation state nationalism. These are the forces acting upon us. And in some ways, the majority in Singapore are, especially the Chinese, the elites, right, are reproducing that. And there are bigger, deeper structural issues than simply, Chinese and Malay.
Yes, but also I think, when we talk about neoliberal like economics, I'm not an expert in this, but when we talk about the development of neoliberal like economics, I don't think it's ever like relinquish its racist underpinnings.
Of course, yeah. No, yeah, of course.
So
I mean, that's how you create boundaries, right? Through race.
So I think in an ideal situation, I hear what you're saying. In an ideal situation, like, we would like to like not like kind of like put ourselves into it. And I think I'm gonna admit it is a struggle, in that sense. Like I don't want to see things in race, right? Because then I'm just like what you say, internalizing it. But also, how do I address this issue without ignoring, these very racist like structures? So I think that's something that I feel like there's a lot of conversation like that still needs to be done. I think one like form of frustration I have is, when we talk about race and development in Singapore, the whole conversation revolves around the term Chinese privilege, right? And people argue about it for like 1 hour, but nothing really gets like solved, or like, oh, this is a Western like concept, and then another party will be like, oh, everything is Western, and it just that never progresses in that aspect. I think for me, the question would be, when we talk about structures, have we done anything at all in removing these structures? And I think the answer is no. We haven't done it. The state, even though they claim that, oh, like, yes, we see that this is an issue and we need to address it, they have not done anything about it. And for me, the reason why I feel that way is because they are still conforming things to what the majority wants. We take a very simple example of like, oh, Singapore is not ready for non-Chinese prime minister.
I mean,
okay,
that's
like
nonsense.
yeah, right.
We
Like
all
okay,
know that's
yeah,
nonsense.
and who it's not even the like young Chinese people. We're talking about like the old, Chinese community, like who's gatekeeping this in that sense. So okay, we get it. That's who you're pleasing. And then the whole hijab issue. It does like rub me, and I think a lot of like Muslim women the wrong way when it said, oh, we are concerned about how the non-Muslims are going to take to more Muslim women wearing the hijab or the tudung. And I'm just like, okay, so why are we still giving space, right, to people who do not see us as part of the community, who are racist or who are Islamophobic? We are still living in a society that conforms to that. So then I think for me, as at least for like a young Malay Muslim woman, would be how do you tackle this issue, right? How do you listen to what the state is saying, and try and convince them like, hey, like we shouldn't be racializing things, but at the same time realizing that if you completely ignore the barriers of race in trying to bring that up, it's not going to go like anywhere either. And
Right.
within the Malay community, like if I can share, PJ, like I was once in it was like a closed door like session, with like some committee leaders, and the idea was, we have all these like issues that the Malays are facing, let's try and solve them. So the severe Malays, right? Let's gather all these like educated Malays together. And this Malay uncle who was part of the community, he said this. He was like, oh, we need to form more spaces, like more art spaces for the Malay youths, because we cannot make it when it comes to education. When it comes to academics, we cannot make it, And then I was like, I think a couple of us were like, huh? And then he went on to say, yeah, like how, the blacks succeeded at basketball, that's how we are. And I was like, wow, this guy has like not just internalized it, but what worried me was that he is who I guess the community would see as a mentor, right?
Right.
And if
Right.
you've already had that biasness that your community is like that, then how are you going to actually like break out of this vicious cycle? Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting question that you brought up, and challenge that you've posed, and I won't say I have an answer as of now.
Well,
That a constant like a battle that we are
yeah.
facing. Yeah.
Well, let me pose it a different way, right? Is racism a symptom or the cause of the divisions and the poverty in your community, of the the soft bigotry, the stereotypes, right? And can you solve it by focusing on race, or do you need to transcend it? Because okay, so here's the counter argument, right? And this is a very old argument that dates back decades to that Singaporeans were having in the 50s, when we were talking about how do we build a nation state after independence and transcend race. Because the argument is, if you struggle for the rights of any community within the whole political unit, okay, let's call it country for shorthand, okay? So if you struggle for the rights of any community within the country as a whole, you, in the short term, deepen the differences between that community and everyone else, and you can potentially alienate everyone else against your community, because the problem is every community feels that they're oppressed or a minority in a certain way, right? The majority of the Chinese community, it's another myth that the Chinese are rich. The majority of the Chinese community are descended from coolies. We've never been rich, right? We're all working class. It's only a very tiny minority, the descendants of either the tycoons or modern day elites, politicians, civil servants, who are rich and elite. So they, and also let's not forget the other bugbear of the Chinese community or the Indian community is language, right? Their languages, they also feel discriminated against. So not to say that anyone is more discriminated or less discriminated against, right? Intersectionality, but to say that everyone believes they are discriminated against and feels that they're discriminated against, and historically have cause to feel that they're discriminated against in Singapore, which is very, dominated by, I think Michael Bard defined 5 characteristics of the elite, right? Including that you're male, you're English educated, right? You're ethnic Chinese, and you've done NS, right? And to a lesser extent, the last one I think is that you're Christian, right? So if you're not all five, then you have some cause to feel discriminated against, and that's 95% of Singapore. So the question comes back to, if you keep talking about race, does that make things better or worse? How do you build a community that ends discrimination if you only talk about the manifestations of it rather than the structural causes of it? You see my argument?
Yeah.
So how do you address, like at the sharp end of the stick would be, how do you address a Chinese uncle living in HDB who's a Grab driver and doing a second job and struggling to feed his family, and tell him that there's Chinese privilege, right?
Yep.
And then if you struggle for Malay rights, then he'll say, why is your community benefiting at my expense, right? Why are you so special that you get more when I am also struggling? I can't, I went to Nanta and I'm driving a Grab or a taxi, right? I have a university degree that's not recognized. I can't make ends meet. I've struggled all my life, right? And that's what people in the 50s were also talking about. They're like, and that's the question. Do you struggle for the rights of everyone and try and suppress differences? Or do you bring out differences to struggle for everyone's individual rights, but then knowing that that would sharpen the conflicts within your society? And in the end, what they agreed was class was the way forward. So even though economic relationships are the most powerful determining factor in how we lead our lives and how people see us, right? In terms of how we're treated by society and governments, we instead focus on identity and nationalism, right? Identity markers like race or gender, sexuality, instead of looking at class consciousness and economic relationships, even though capitalism is the most powerful force that shapes our society. So is this part of the problem then, to talk about race rather than class?
I guess that's when, people bring up intersectionality, right? Where if I bring up something doesn't mean I'm not acknowledging.
Okay, but hold on. I'm making a political argument, right? So intersectionality, yes. But my question is, how do we resolve this conflict between, if you bring up race, you risk sharpening the difference and alienating the majority, and you need a majority in order to create change. You see my point? Whereas if the counter argument would be, you need to protect the rights of every single individual and every single community. This is the central paradox. The more you fight for individual rights, the more we risk fracturing our broad coalition of people who want to create change. Because the more you put people at loggerheads with each other within the community of people who are oppressed by the elites.
Yes, but I think to assume that everyone, also I'm not saying that you assume, but when if people I feel defensive when a racial minority brings up something, they need to understand that it's not an attack on that person, right? So if I bring up very interesting point about a Grab driver, right, or who lives in a HDB, of course, we acknowledge the erasure of the Chinese dialects. My grandma's Chinese, she can't speak to her nieces and nephews because she doesn't speak Mandarin, she only speaks Malay and Cantonese. But that saying, let's say you have a Malay auntie and a Chinese auntie, or Malay uncle, Chinese uncle, who is of the same economic class. Both of them can't speak English. One can only speak Mandarin and the other one can only speak Malay. Then the question would be, who would find it easier to survive in this country, right? Where would the support for each person come? You have stories of minorities who can speak Mandarin and still not get a job, right? You have stories of minorities who get frustrated because their work meeting is in Chinese. So it goes beyond yes, we are oppressed by the elites, but sometimes for us, even before we can address that, we have to address the issue that's happening within our circles. We have to like go through one step of like, hey guys, like let's like even a basic of let's speak in English, in a work meeting, which affects, our job. And then, and then we still have to address what the elite is doing. So there's that ever, I think, labor when it comes to race. But of course, I do hear where you're coming from, and I obviously don't agree with, isolating it. But I think it's, how do we speak about it with the majority understanding it's not a personal attack. It's like, hey, this is happening, and sometimes it's a hindrance from coming together to actually address what the elites are doing, right? Which is why it's very interesting. Sometimes you hear like, Malays who live in like rental flats, I don't have time for this. I just need to feed my kids. You want me to talk about the government? I don't have time. And it makes me think like, where is my position? And fair enough, right? When you talk about, let's say, a Chinese man who drives Grab from morning to night because he has to take care of the family, as compared to me, who probably definitely earns more than he does. But sometimes when you get on the Grab, the first thing they say, like, I like would be very racist remarks, and then that already causes a split in that sense. So I think the focus would be, how can we address the issue of race? Because sometimes it's not about just when we complain, or people assume that we complain when we raise these issues. Most of the time it's actually also an issue of safety, right? Are we able to tell you like, hey, I experienced this today? Because a lot of times we second guess ourselves, is this really racism? Are we like really experiencing it, or are we just being sensitive? And that again takes a lot of labor, and sometimes we already have to do that labor to our Chinese friends who are more progressive, but still may not really completely understand in that aspect, yeah. So sometimes it's like, again, just because you are a guy who is left-leaning or is more progressive in certain parts doesn't mean you're not misogynistic, right? And just because you see how oppressive a state is doesn't mean you cannot reproduce certain racial stereotypes or very racist ideologies. So I think as a double minority, I think that is like I won't say a hindrance, but that is a step that we have to go through sometimes to tell our Chinese friends like, hey, like actually your ideas is still quite problematic when it comes to race. We appreciate and we definitely on the same page when it comes to talking about, let's say, freedom of press or certain issues that the death penalty, but when it comes to race, it's still very much problematic, right? I have faced like minority men, brown men, who are also supposedly very progressive in terms of being critical of the state, but they are the most misogynistic bunch of people I know, right? So yes, you can talk about race, but when it comes to gender, they are really misogynistic. So that is like, I guess for me as like a Malay woman, that's the biggest challenge I have, I think, when we talk about like politics.
If you can unpack that a bit, right? Because that is in a nutshell the problem that I pose, that you need to find common cause with this theoretical Malay man who's very misogynistic, and you can find common cause on race, but you're really opposed on gender. How do you do that?
I've come to realize, at least, this is very Malay men who are misogynistic but are very progressive when it comes to, let's say, state oppression. Actually a lot of it comes from inherent biasness of what the Malay community is. So that's something they have not unpacked yet, race, and because everything is so intertwined, sometimes you realize you've only like unpacked a certain part, but if not unpack a certain another part, you still probably grew up feeling inferior that you have not like dealt with, so you want the appeal of, I guess, the majority like community, so I realize these are like men who will not talk about gender so much, or sometimes their works may revolve around state oppression, but they will not talk about race because they want to appeal to the more like liberal like majority, who may not be comfortable talking about race either. Yeah, like I said, you can be Chinese and you can be against state oppression, but you may not be comfortable like talking about race, like let's say like what I'm doing with you right now, like, yeah, let's talk about state oppression, but yeah, when it comes to race, I don't want to talk about it. So these brown men, because they want to appeal to the majority, because they themselves face racism without realizing it. A lot of their politics, is very pick and choose. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this because I know like my majority friends will be comfortable with me talking about it. But when it comes to race and gender, yeah, like I still have a lot of like inherent like misogyny or biasness that I have not like unpacked yet.
So it sounds like they're defending their privilege. Where they are privileged, they defend it.
Yeah.
Where they are not, they protest.
Yeah. And you have that for like, I think if, okay, gender aside, just like Malay political elites, right? When you raise something, they be like, oh, but I made it. So maybe it's not a race problem, maybe it's a you problem, right? Yeah.
Right.
So, like, well, I'm the token like Malay in the Navy. So like, yeah, like there's no racism in the Navy,
Yes,
like,
yes.
yeah. So
I've
I
been
met
told
my
that,
like
yeah,
that.
there was one Malay general, and therefore there's no racism in the
Yes,
SAF.
yeah. So one generation after like how many years,
Yes.
Yeah. So which I guess essentially boils down to me the issue of power, right?
Yeah.
Who are we protecting? Who are we giving space to? Are we protecting people in power who are not willing to change status quo, who doesn't want to change status quo? Do we want to change status quo? Do we want to give up our privilege? And that's something that is very fascinating also, I think, as a minority, because the moment you've maybe like achieved certain like economic status, there's this whole debate about whether you have a right to talk about class issue, because being I guess a Malay minority, the idea of success is always like, we always assume that there's only like a percentage of like Malays who can be successful. Like we have to fight for a spot, and it's become so ingrained that like we must always be living in poverty. Doesn't mean we don't critique capitalist structures. Of course, we still do, but this assumption that we must always be living in poverty because we are Malay.
Sounds like, a catch-22. If you live in poverty, oh, well, clearly you're not smart enough because you haven't broken out of poverty. Whereas if you break out of poverty, oh, you no longer understand what it means to be poor.
Yeah, So this false, I think, race aside, this false idea that someone who lives in poverty immediately breaks out of poverty when they have education, right? I think that is like race and gender aside, which is not true, because a lot of times, your family may only have enough to maybe like send one child to university education, and then it's dependent on you to be able to help support the family. So you may have like a good starting pay in that sense, but most of that pay goes into like supporting your siblings, your parents, and things like that. So the idea of like economic success, especially when it comes to like race, because a lot of these very, very successful like Malays, or like, especially in elite power, they do come from privileged like families, right? And that's why there's this need, during like political like elections, for them to play up the poverty. Oh, I grew up in a kampong, climb trees, that's why I didn't do well in school. Which downplays the fact that you do have like a bunch of elite Malays who are also protecting their status quo, and they are not interested in changing it because no one wants to give up their privilege. Yeah.
Okay. If I can summarize a bit, then it sounds like there's certain things that the problem structurally in Singapore, there's a lack of time, right? First, you mentioned people in your community, and actually people in every community don't want to get involved in politics because they say we have no time. We need to feed our families, right? And that leads to the myth that, oh, people in Singapore, voters, the majority of voters only care about bread and butter issues.
Yes.
I think people care about a lot of things, but when you're poor, when you're struggling to make ends meet, it focuses your mind on a few things. And so that's the first thing, right? Time, and then the second would be space. We in Singapore, it feels like we don't have the space to talk about certain issues. Because obviously the PAP has made it very clear they don't want us talking about race, they don't want us talking about religion, they don't want us to talk about certain issues in which they have not managed to solve after how many 70 years, 70 something years in power, right? Since 59, right? They have not managed to solve the deep fractures that exist in our society over people of different race and people who speak different languages, people who have different religions. So with language, they solved it by imposing a single language on everyone. But with race and religion, they can't solve it. So they just refuse to let us talk about it. And as a result, it feels like we don't have the experience or maturity to talk about these things. And then the third thing, what I'm hearing is there's a certain impatience, I think, to these issues, that we want them solved now, but they are very deep-seated issues which take time. So every time we talk about them, there's a desire to get them solved immediately, when actually these sort of issues take hundreds of years maybe to solve, right? Patient work of bridging differences. But again, we live in a country where the government's like, no, we're not willing to have this dialogue debate. Shut it down. We'll solve it right now by just imposing a system on everyone, whether that's a CMIO or just, a certain number of religions and religious leaders are recognized, and they then are in charge of controlling that community, right? So, and then the last thing I'm hearing is it's also power. And this is another problem in Singapore, where because power is so winner takes all, the moment you have some power, you're terrified of losing it. And you don't have any expectation that, power will change hands. And so it becomes a very zero-sum game. You got to hold on to it and keep others out of it, and hold on to your privilege at any cost. So yeah, so that's kind of my summation of what I'm hearing. Like, we have these horrible racism in Singapore, but we can't solve it because we don't have the time, we don't have the space, we don't have the process, the trust, and the people in power are really threatened by it. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, but also, I think for me, like, especially when I get like online, and you see like the younger generation getting like more vocal about it, and even the majority like might like, I guess Gen Zs are starting to understand and they don't take it personally. I think it's amazing. And I would like, I guess in the near future, going back to, what we were talking about, what is this idea of solidarity, right? Because I think that is very important. And I think in some sense we are building into it, and I hope we, that like we can go deeper into that, into what this idea of solidarity is, because I guess in some sense people are recognizing the issues and they can point it out, right? It's just that like I think among all of the things that you've pointed out, we've never really had a chance to like sit down and like, hey guys, we've seen all of this, like how can we move forward, but again, because sometimes it's hard not to, right, to get like distracted by like whatever is going behind, because every time we see another like IPS like conference, we're like, oh no, not this again, like here we go again, it feels like we're going back. So I think it's also learning, like, while it's important to understand what is going on the ground, to also not let it, I think, push back the progress that we've made.
Okay, but to come back to solidarity, right? I think that's a good point. But that brings us back to my earlier point. How do you build solidarity with people when those people might be fundamentally opposed to you on other issues? Whether, on the class level, it's with the Chinese Nanta graduate who's a Grab driver. Whether on a gender level, it's the Malay misogynistic man. You want to build racial solidarity with the Malay man, but then you're deeply divided on gender solidarity. You want to build class solidarity with the Chinese uncle, but then you're deeply divided on race. So how do we do this? How do we build solidarity with people when in other facets of identity they're deeply divided from you? I think that's a really fundamental question here. And that's because these markers of identity have been so used to divide us and atomize us in Singapore that it becomes hard to build that solidarity, because that's how the elites divide us. All these other ways they use. If we fight on identity politics in this area, elites use identity politics in that area to divide us, right? So it feels like the very same thing that empowers us in groups also divides us, making it really hard for all the oppressed majority, the working class of Singapore, the non-elites who are being really exploited by this racist capitalist system, to seize their rights collectively.
Yeah, I think for me it's like, especially with, let's say, the point about let's say the Chinese Grab driver, right? Possibly, I think one thing that we definitely need to address is like a loss in translation, in that sense. Like, he actually, like what you said, we are all facing the same issue from the same group of elites, right? And we can see that the elite group is multiracial in that aspect. So why are they still like, pushing for policies that essentially are oppressive, right? And maybe, people of our backgrounds, we will have a better understanding of it. So I think that's going back to like why I do what I do, is that I realize that, there is a loss of translation between, let's say, me and a Grab driver when I'm trying to talk about race issue, and when he's trying to talk about like class issue that he faces, but essentially, how do I then, I think this is where my interest like have like gone. How do I translate all these like research papers, which is stuck in this ivory tower, but very, very essential in understanding power and elites and oppression into layman terms,
Right.
so that everyone can be on the same page. I feel that there's this like lack of like, I won't say lack of communication, just that everyone is saying one point, but we can't really understand each other, because where there's a difference in the language that we use or how we express it. It'd be great, I think, in when we talk about solidarity, also having this like language to understand.
So
I think
is that where something like brown is haram comes in? I wanted to talk about that, but
yes, and I think
we're
that,
almost out of time. But yeah,
yeah.
is that part of your how you're
Yes.
trying to make things accessible?
Yeah, so Brown is Haram is a project that I started with my friends Kristen, and also now we've put in Malian Tay, who's our director, into it, because we realized that all three of us come from rather, like, I would say, like privileged education background, but we have similar experiences, and our parents do as well. So we wanted to use narratives, simple narratives, I think, and stories, to put experiences out there, including ours. So how do we use this common stories, and like form a language that is accessible to all? So regardless of whether, like, you come from a certain background, you can still come, watch, and understand what we are trying to say. So language was very important for me. For at least my part of the writing, I was I really made sure that I didn't use any like big words or languages, in writing down my part. Because like I said, for me, whenever I do any form of work, it's very, very important that your nasi padang or your chai fan auntie can understand what I'm trying to say. Because there's no point in like me, or even as a brown woman, to do all this kind of work, but like, the makcik doesn't get it, and I have the like class privilege as compared to her in that sense. So for me, like, language is very, very crucial in, I think, addressing these issues and how accessible it is.
Okay, and what else have you got in the pipeline? What else can we look forward to?
Well, I'll be presenting at the Singapore Art Week. So if you watch Raw is Haram, there's a segment on me pretending to like, or to look, or me exploring what this idea of like a successful Malay woman look like. So that will be on a video form.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Mysara. And thank you, our listener, for tuning in. And if you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to support it, please go to newnarrative.com/join to join New Narrative as a member, or go to newnarrative.com/donate to donate. We really need your support. New Narrative is a member-supported organization, and we really do need your support to keep going. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about New Narrative, please check out this playlist up here. And if you'd like to watch episodes of Political Agenda, please check out this playlist down here. Thank you very much, and please help keep New Narrative sustainable and independent by joining as a member at newnarrative.com/join. Thank you.